Okay, good morning. Good morning here and good evening in Australia. So today we restart our seminar with Professor Stern. As usual, I have a short introduction, remembering also which are the steps of our seminars, and after a short introduction of the professor and also the topic of today. I remember we started with economic modeling seminars with our second round, the second list, that is organized by Italian Association of Environmental Resource Economists and European Association of Environmental Resource Economists, University of Brescia, and with the support of European University Institute, University of Siena, Department of Economics and Management, University of Padua, and Department of Environmental Science and Policy, University of Milan, and Fondazione Enrico Mattei, in which we are here in this very beautiful library in order to start with our seminar. We started in 2020, so I remember a little bit our list of seminars. We started with Robert Pindyck, Professor Hill, Professor Zwart in 2020. After we started 2021 with Professor Toll, Bergman, Professor Gollier, Professor Van der Plug, Professor Gerlach, Professor Kunduri, Professor Metcalfe, and we arrived to our conference in April, our Italian Association of Environmental Resource Economists, with Professor Nordhauser and again Professor Pindyck. And we started in the summer with Professor Stevens, Professor Akins, Professor Mendelssohn, Professor Spence, and we started with new stream of list of seminars with Professor Killian this year. 2 weeks ago, Professor Mattilinski, and today we have the honor to have here Professor D.Stern. The next events that are now arranged for our seminars, the next will be on the 7th of April with Professor Zmalinski from MIT. After we are arranging with Professor Greenstone, Professor Rogoff, Spence, and Professor Sachs, and also others that we are engaging for our seminars. So now introduce our seminar today. So the seminar is from Professor D.Stern, which is professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy, the Australian National University. Professor associated in the Center of Applied Microeconomic Analysis and Center for Climate Economics and Policy. About his research topics are energy economics, economic growth, and economic history, climate change, and among others. Among the long list of his CV, I collected some of his roles that are professor at the Australian National University, visiting the Center for Energy and Environmental Studies and the Department of Geography, Boston University, Director of International and Development Economics, Crawford School, Director of Research at Crawford School of Public Policy, lead author, IPCC Working Group 3 for the 5th assessment report, chapters 5 related to driver strengths and mitigations. Center for, and worked also for Center for Resource and Environmental Studies, Australian National University. And is also editorial, so I collected all of the editorial of Professor Stern, Ecological Economics, Energy Journals, Energies, among others. So the list is longer, so I cut them some of these ones. About his research, more in depth related to papers, we have more than 90 articles. Among them, there are the most important that are Journal Economic Literature, Journals Economic Ethics, Energy Policy, Energy Economics, Ecological Economics, Energy Journals, and others. And in books and chapters, there are more than 30 chapters, and also some books edited by D.Stern that are the economics of nature and nature of economics, climate change and the world economy, new dimension in ecological economics. Among other things, Professor Stern in the top ranking in the ideas ranking related to energy economics and environmental economics, especially in this because are more in line with our seminar, our associations. Okay, now I leave the floor to Professor Stern. The title of the presentation is Asymmetric Response of Carbon Emission to Recession, Expansion, and Oil Market Shocks. I remember only a couple of routes that in general the professor will explain his presentation. He's preparing this. We collect the Q&A, so the questions by chat. Also, it's possible at the end of the presentation to have a part devoted to Q&A session. Thank you a lot, Professor Stern, to be here. His time also because it's evening and night in Australia. It's a pleasure to have here. It's an honor to have here, and thank you. Invite you formally in the future to come here in Italy, in Brescia, and also Milan in film. Okay, thank you. I leave the floor to you. Thank you.
That looks good. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to give a seminar in this series. I'm very honored with a list of very famous and illustrious speakers preceded me. It's probably a good follow-up to Lutz Kilian's present seminar that was about a month ago, as it's sort of on a somewhat related topic. But this is a I have to say, this is quite exploratory research. So I'm not sure it quite lives up to the title of economic modeling. And it was really inspired by us seeing the recession in 2020 and the pandemic, and there's a steep fall in carbon emissions at the time, and we wondered, is that different to previous recessions, or is it actually quite typical of previous recessions? Can we learn something from the pandemic and its effect on carbon emissions about the relationship between the business cycle and carbon emissions more generally? Okay, so I did this research also with my PhD student, Shuating Jiang. So it's actually a joint paper with her. So the question is, do carbon emissions fall faster relative to GDP in recessions when they rise in economic expansions? The most research about carbon emissions and economic growth is looking very much of a very long run picture. And there are a smaller number of papers which are looking at these shorter term variations in emissions. And they're looking at those papers. Probably the main conclusion from a literature, there are some contradictory results, but the main conclusion is that, at least using US data, that carbon emissions fall faster relative to the change in GDP in recessions than in expansions of the economy. So basically looking at the ratio of carbon emissions to the change in carbon emissions to the change in GDP. And probably the most representative paper in this literature is one by Tamara Sheldon from University of South Carolina. It's published in 2017 in Energy Economics. And we'll focus on the results she got using first differences. She also used levels of the variables, also first differences. So looking at the results on the right-hand side from her paper. So in column 3, this column here, if you can see the cursor as I move it around, here just the dependent variable is the change in the log of carbon emissions, and the explanatory variable is the change in the log of GDP, and find a coefficient of about 0.6. So GDP is growing, carbon emissions are rising. There's also very big and statistically significant constant, which is basically the time effect. So even though there was no economic growth, during the period of her data, according to the regression result, carbon emissions were rising. And she used data from 1950 to 2011 for the United States, quarterly data. So that is what the regression is based on. And then she did something interesting here, which what this literature is doing, is to split growth between quarters when GDP growth was positive and quarters when GDP growth was negative, and estimate the elasticity in each of those periods separately. So she finds here that when you split the GDP growth into positive and negative parts of the variable, in the quarters when GDP growth is positive, there is a small positive but statistically insignificant effect on carbon emissions. But on the other hand, when GDP growth, well, was negative, when the GDP declined in those quarters, as a large, more elasticity greater than one effect on carbon emissions at 1.8. In fact, here, and very statistically significant. So she finds that carbon emissions fall in recession strongly, but didn't particularly grow due to, well, the growth in carbon emissions the rest of the time was not correlated with growth in the GDP, because again, there is a constant term here. So we are seeing constant growth in carbon emissions irrespective of whether there was economic growth or not. So very asymmetric effect. There's a big effect of changes in GDP and recessions, but not in periods of expansion. Okay. So question is, why is that the case? Well, she suggested that perhaps in recessions, there is a lot of energy intensive capital that gets scrapped by firms that are experiencing bad economic conditions, or fall in demand. But it's just purely speculation. So nobody's really looked at in more detail why there is this asymmetric effect. So that is something I was interested in researching. The question is, well, if that is the case, that emissions respond very asymmetrically to positive or negative changes in GDP, why is that actually important? Well, it is interesting to understand more about the relationship between economic growth or the business cycle and carbon emissions, obviously, but also it could be important in projecting future carbon emissions when we're looking at climate policy. So this is also from Sheldon's paper, and it's projections of growth in carbon emissions from 2012 out to 3 different horizons: 2050, 2075, and 2100. The blue is the baseline here is a deterministic projection of carbon emissions, and then the other two allow for stochastic variation in GDP. The first column, or the middle column of each set of 3 columns, is assuming that the effect of GDP growth on carbon emissions is symmetric. Okay, so that is going back to her model here. And then the third column is her asymmetric model. So she finds there's something of if you assume symmetry, there's more growth in carbon emissions in her asymmetric model. So she argues that you take into account the effect of recessions, there'll be a little bit less growth in carbon emissions than you'd otherwise expect. So not dramatic, but there is a difference here. So her data cover the period 1950 to 2011, as I said. So that period now ends more than a decade ago. And since then, we've had a recession, a very short one. The official 2020 recession in the US actually only lasted 2 months, 2 months of falling GDP. And it was associated with a very steep fall in carbon dioxide emissions. So it's interesting to see whether this changes the results when we take into consideration the 2020 recession, or is it similar to past recessions? So there's actually now estimates of daily carbon emissions, and this was from a paper published in Nature 2020, very quickly after the published papers, much faster in natural science journals, of course, than you can in economics ones typically. Yes, using estimates of monthly carbon emission, daily carbon emissions globally. So the blue line here, or purple or violet line, is what happened in 2019 and the average level of carbon emissions in 2019. And then the red line is the what actually happened in 2020. So the data ends mid-year in 2020, but we can see already in February they're tracking a bit lower as the pandemic started in China, the lockdown in Wuhan and so forth. And then as the pandemic spread to other countries, the gap between two gets bigger, and around about here we probably have something like a 10–15% reduction in emissions, and the average shows something like about, for that first part of the year, about emissions about 10% lower. So there was a big fall in carbon emissions. And there was lots of speculation about that at the time in various articles. Of course, the cause of this recession was very unusual, as we all know, due to the pandemic. And I selected here data from Italy. So obviously there was a big change in mobility. And here we see pretty much, this is data from, again, daily data from Google, which I got from this great website, Our World in Data. You can get one of these graphs for every country in the world. It shows various locations people are at, parks, transit stations, workplaces, everything collapsed by more than from 50 to 80% as the pandemic started in Italy. And of course, staying at home increased a lot. So there was a big change in mobility. So it seems likely that the reduction in carbon emissions, a lot of it came from reduction in transport. And then, well, we went through a few cycles. Apparently a lot of people went to parks in Italy during these peaks here. It's interesting, if you look at the Australian data, going to parks never really recovered in Australia. Well, it recovered, but it never went above the zero line throughout the whole of the pandemic. But we can see workplaces still haven't fully recovered from this reduction in mobility. Residential still a little bit higher than it was. Going to retail stores did recover somewhat. Anyways, that's Italy. The US looks, which my data is from, looks very similar, just less extreme. So Italy has these huge fluctuations. The US, where of course the pandemic differed across the country much more, when it was more intense in one place or another. Early on, it was strongest in New York City area, later in other parts of the country. So we see a less pronounced increase of people staying at home versus reduction in transport, and again some similar trends since then. But the main period we're looking at is this initial impact of the pandemic in sort of March, April, May of 2020. Okay. So was this drop in emissions unusual? So this is again another paper, this one from Nature Climate Change, and this breaks down the change in emission by sector, and this is in tons, or millions of tons, and this is global. Okay, so you see the first impact of the pandemic in China, and then in the rest of the world after a bit of a bounce back here. So these are millions of tons. So these are all on one scale, and these are on a smaller scale. So this is electricity generation. It went down. Industrial energy use emissions from industry also went down. But surface transport takes the biggest fall in total emissions, as we would expect. There's this sudden reduction in mobility. And then look at the other sectors, which altogether all have smaller changes. You see the scale is only about a fifth as big as the scale up here. The biggest falls in aviation again, and bigger than the change in public, and residential actually increased, of course, as you'd expect. Okay, so a big fall, there's a fall across the board, but apart from residential, but particularly in transport. So this could be quite unusual. Okay. All right, so that is sort of the introduction about previous literature and what actually happened during the pandemic. We're going to look at a much longer period, all the way back to 1973. Up to the end of 2020. I haven't updated the data since then. It might be something interesting to do, but probably won't change the results very much. So we have monthly data, and the nice thing of one reason to use US data is because they have monthly energy data, monthly CO2 data going all the way back to 1973. So and also on the energy broken down as different fuels, so there's very detailed data. A reason I wanted to go to monthly data, though Sheldon used quarterly data, is because the actual recession in the US only lasted 2 months. So he felt that using quarterly data might not give us a very good picture of what actually happened. It'd be better to use monthly data for that. So we use CO2 data from the Energy Information Administration. Because the GDP data has been deseasonalized, we also we deseasonalized the CO2 data and the other data we use just to make it comparable. Okay. So looking at the CO2 data from the US on a monthly basis over the last 50 years or so. Interesting that despite global emissions of CO2 increasing, and the US may be having a reputation of not taking a lot of action on climate change, the US actually finds itself now, where's my, having problems with it. Oops, sorry. The US now finds itself about the same emissions as it had back in 1973. So these are the periods of the oil crises that happened in the 1970s. Emissions are quite flat then. There wasn't also a lot of economic growth. There was an increase up to the Great Recession in 2007. Since then, there's been a decline in carbon emissions. And the drivers of this is a continuous fall in energy intensity over time. Said growth was quite slow in the early period, and we've also seen a shift away from coal in particular to natural gas in electricity generation and to renewables as well, and also probably slower growth in this later period since 2007, which you've also seen, at least in the official numbers, in Europe as well. So we can see the impacts of various recessions, which are going to be, well, that's the Great Recession there, the COVID one there, and the earlier ones in 73, 4, and in 1982. You can see dips in emissions in those periods. This is 2001, about here. Okay, and now another good thing about the US is there is now actually a monthly GDP series. So up till now, there's been monthly industrial production data from the US and from many other countries as well. Problem with industrial productions is industrial production. If we're interested in things like transport, we want to include that in our measure of economic output. And so having a monthly GDP series is a very useful thing. You in fact do get somewhat different results using GDP versus industrial production in this case, for reasons you'll probably guess at and you'll see as I go on. So this is Brave, Butters, and Kelly indexes of monthly GDP. And it actually goes back into the 60s, I think. And you can get it from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago's website, regularly updated. So it's not the official series from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, but they interpolate the official series using various other indicators. So this is the GDP series. You can see the biggest change in GDP was this recent recession. So it was a huge shock to GDP, though it bounced back quite a lot fairly quickly. near the Great Recession in 2007 to 8, when to now, well, is here, and then the other previous recessions make less of an impact. This one's very brief, as you can see. We also use data on the official recessions from National Bureau of Economic Research. So they decide which month a recession started and which it ended, which again, with monthly data, we can actually precisely use the timing of recessions. And we get other data for our fuel use and CO2 emissions by sectors also from the Energy Information Administration. So this is a little background of the data we're using. Now, most basic model is a symmetric model, very similar to what Sheldon used. The percentage change in carbon emissions as a function of percentage change in GDP, the simplest possible model you can imagine. Later on, I'll look at some sort of with lags as well, but basically we're just interested in if GDP changes, how much at the same time are carbon emissions changing. And an asymmetric, and we're not making a causal interpretation of this at all. Okay, so I'm not saying changes in GDP are causing changes in carbon emissions. Obviously, to some degree that is true, but we're just trying to see how these two variables move together. And an asymmetric model, I did something a little bit different to Sheldon. So she split it between the data between months or quarters of positive GDP growth and quarters of negative GDP growth. Here I just have the GDP growth variable here, and then this is a dummy variable for if GDP fell in this month, then this variable has a value of 1. If it rose or didn't change in this month, has a value of 0. So beta 2 directly measures the difference between periods of growth and periods of decline, rather than in GDP, rather than coming up with two elasticities. I mean, I could have done the way she did and just then do a test of whether these two coefficients are equal or not. But I thought showing directly what the difference is between recessions and expansions was a clearer way of showing the results. There are different ways to parameterize the same model. Now, there are some periods when GDP rises by in one particular month in the middle of a recession or something like that. So here, instead, we use a dummy variable, which is 1 for the months which are in the National Bureau of Economic Research's official recessions, and 0 for months that are not in their recessions. Okay, so then we just assume within that period of official recession, it's all recession. Okay, so again, this is measuring the difference between the two periods. So these are initial, very simple, basic results, and this is a symmetric model. Here we got quite a big coefficient on, this is using all the data up to the end of 2020, quite a big coefficient on GDP growth, okay, and very significant. Also, there's a very significant negative trend here. So this is a monthly trend. So this is like 3.5% a year. So it's saying carbon emissions are falling irrespective of whether there's economic growth or not. This is kind of the opposite of what Sheldon found for the earlier period of carbon emissions rising, whether there was economic growth or not. And then we look at our two different versions of the asymmetric model. This is the first one is when we have a dummy variable for positive versus negative economic growth in that month. And again, there's a positive coefficient during the expansions, but there's a significant positive difference between expansions and contractions. So the elasticity, just like Sheldon found, is larger in recessions. And I think we didn't omitted this here because it was statistically insignificant, but I'm not quite sure what happened to the constants here on this table. I'm now wondering, but it was small. And the main result of interest is this. So then when we used the dummy variable for the MBR recessions versus expansions, results are kind of similar. There's actually a bigger difference though between recessions and expansions, but it shows the results are somewhat similar. Okay. This is all the data, and you can see quite a doesn't at first look, the data in the middle here doesn't at first look like there's that strong a relationship between the variables. Note though the scales are different here, so this monthly growth for GDP is a smaller range than the range for CO2. So CO2 is a lot more volatile than the changes in GDP. There's a lot of volatility. By the way, in all these models, I should have mentioned, we include some weather variables, which I haven't explicitly represented here. So we have heating degree days, or change in heating degree days, in fact, and monthly changes in cooling degree days. So they don't really change the parameter estimates much, but they do change. They do make the standard errors a bit smaller than they otherwise would be. But you see here in this graph that there's some big outliers in GDP growth and decline. Here's a 6% fall in a month, and when's that? That's in March 2020 and April 2020. So looks like almost the 2020 recession might be really an outlier that's driving this whole result. When we look at the data without 2020, there is a flatter relationship. Again, here the scale of GDP changes even smaller than there was in this graph, whereas of course the CO2 range hasn't changed that much. So the fact the line looks so flat here is a little bit misleading. But yeah, there's definitely less of a relationship when we drop 2020. So 2020 was this really big shock and a very big change. So that got us thinking about, well, if 2020 makes quite a bit of difference to the results, what happens when we look at each recession individually? So from now on, we just use this recession dummy rather than a positive and negative one. So it makes it easier to talk about a dummy for each individual recession. And so we just expanded the model here to, again, have just GDP growth here, whether it's positive or negative, and then GDP growth multiplied by a recession dummy, where there's a separate dummy for each recession. There were 7 recessions during this period. From 1973 to 2020. Okay, so we can now estimate asymmetric effect for each individual recession. So just a reminder about US recessions. There was one in 1973 to 75 associated with the first oil price shock. Another one in 1980 was the oil price shock started in 1979 following the Iranian Revolution and the invasion of Iran by Iraq and so forth. There was one in 81, 82, 1991. This is around the time of the second Gulf War when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And 2001, this recession started before the September 11th terrorist attack in New York. So it was already getting going before that, and happened during that period. And then 2008-9. Recent Great Recession, and then the 2021, which is really short. So we did a dummy for each of these individual recessions. Again, GDP growth has a positive effect, but when we look at individual recessions, and each one of these is consisting of several months of data, in some cases a couple of years of data. So it's not like just one data point. There's a quite varied results. We find 1973-5 a positive, significant difference between that recession and growth in general. So that means that carbon emissions fell faster rather than the GDP than they did in a typical expansion period. And in 1980, similar, somewhat smaller, but also positive significant coefficient. Now in 81, 82, we find negative coefficients. Again, in 1991, we find a positive coefficient. 2001, not statistically significant. 2008 to 9, not statistically significant. So this is saying there's no difference between these recessions and typical expansions in how much carbon emissions change relative to GDP. And then in 2020, a big positive effect, significant effect, similar to the 1990, 91, 73, 75, and 1980. So yeah, why are there differences between these? And it turns out we have an explanation. It's not perfectly neat, clear cut, but we think it's somewhat convincing. So some recessions, 1973 to 5, the first oil price shock in the late 1973, 1980 following the, well, during the shock that happened off from 1979, and 1990-91, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, there were negative oil supply shocks. So price of oil rose in reaction to a drop in supply, or probably Lutz Killian would say, expected drop in supply. So there's quite a lot of debate about these shocks to oil prices. Are they driven by expectations or by actual fall in supply? He argues they're mostly about expectations, and James Hamilton argues they're mostly about actual falls in supply, so it really depends what model you use. Try to steer clear from that in this actual paper. In 2020, we have the opposite. Oil prices fall, and there's instead, rather than a supply shock to oil, there's a fall, a sudden fall, an unexpected fall in demand. Both of those, though, both the unexpected fall in supply and an unexpected fall in demand, both of those end up with there being less oil used, okay, irrespective of what happens to prices. So here we see the history of oil prices, real and nominal, and adjusted, I think, for CPI. Yeah, because it's monthly data. So there was a big shock here in 73. The blue shading are those MBR recessions. The second shock getting going in 79, continuing through this first recession here, peaking before the next recession. Oil prices were actually falling by the time this second recession got going, and they really collapsed in 85. I see various changes here, and then this is the Asian financial crisis coming around about 1998. Prices are rising again. Again, they were beginning to fall before the NBR actually declared a recession in 2001. Here there's a fall due to the September 11th reduced, made economic conditions worse, reduced air travel in the US in particular. So it was a bit of a further fall in oil prices here. But then we see this great big rise in oil prices. And the argument, if you look in the literature, is that this was not driven by the supply side, but by rising demand, particularly in China and India. And so there's not a supply shock. Oil use wasn't falling during this period. It was the rising oil use which was driving up the price of oil. This changed once the recession got underway, and oil use fell, and globally, and of course, and the price of oil fell. Came back up again, fell back down again due to fracking, etc. And then we see the 2020 COVID. A bit of trouble with the cursor here, depending on what I do with the go-to webinar window that I can see here. We can see here the maybe I can the fall in the oil price related to the pandemic. Okay, let's see. Okay, maybe if I could put the, no, I don't want to close that. Just, yeah, okay. So It's a bit controversial that oil supply shocks actually explain these recessions, or it just happened coincidental with them. Some people argue that, some research argues that it was the Federal Reserve's reaction to the rise in oil prices that caused the recession. So, again, I don't really want to get into those causes in detail. So I'm not arguing that oil price shocks caused those recessions. I'm arguing that they had an effect on carbon emissions. Other recessions may be explained by rising interest rates or financial events. So we see here interest rates in the US, and they typically go up before recessions, and they cut during recessions. Here's the 81-82 recession is preceded by a big increase in interest rates. And Paul Volcker was the chair of the Federal Reserve. And here is the Great Recession. So yeah, that does tend to be the trend that they go up before, but particular looking at 1981-82 interest rates seem to be related to that recession. 2001, there was a big collapse in the NASDAQ stock market, the first, the so-called dot-com bust, 2008-9, the subprime mortgages. So these seem to be the events that people related more to these recessions. Anyway, there weren't oil supply shocks during those periods. Even the price of oil had risen prior. So the four asymmetric recessions we think hypothesize are related to these negative oil market shocks, whether supply or demand. So this is quite sort of exploratory. They haven't really developed a proper model of the shocks. So we're going to test the hypothesis econometrically. So these explain the asymmetry. And how can we control for them? Well, one idea is simply be putting oil use versus other energy use into the regressions, but that would explain most of the change in carbon emissions. So, for a better way to show what happened is to take out the part of oil use which is linearly related with the GDP, and then the part that remains, the residual, is the asymmetric part. And then also for coal and for natural gas, we did the same. We look at other energy because it doesn't emit carbon. So we have a series of the parts of coal use and oil and gas use which isn't linearly related to the changes in the GDP. So we add them to our models and see if they eliminate the asymmetry and maybe explain why there was an asymmetry in the first place. So these are some regressions which add to the first simple asymmetric model here. They add the oil residual, so the part of oil that's not linearly related to GDP, coal residual, and the gas residual. All of these are, of course, very significant in explaining changes in carbon emissions. And interesting thing is that this is the recession dummy multiplied by changes in GDP, so the asymmetric effect. When we add the oil residual, it becomes statistically insignificant. But when we add the coal residual or the gas one, natural gas one, it's somewhat similar to the model, the basic asymmetric model. It didn't add any of these sources of energy use. So this looks really nice. We thought it shows that the part of oil use which isn't linearly related to GDP is the part which is causing this asymmetric variation in carbon emissions. So our hypothesis looks good that it's related to these oil market disruptions, because coal and gas don't explain that asymmetry. It remains even when we add them to the regression individually. Then we looked at individual recessions, and we found every case adding all this oil variable to the model. The result is no longer that's general economic growth. This is a 73-5 recession, not significant now. 80 recession, not significant. 81, 82 is negative. None of these other recessions are significant anymore. So in every recession, adding oil to the model took away the positive asymmetry that we had for some of them previously, including 2020, in a similar way to 73, 75, or 1980 or 1990. When we add coal to the regression instead, the asymmetric recession, 73, 5, and 80, and 1990, 91, and 2020, all of them remain positive and significant. So coal has no effect on this, so it's not related to this asymmetry. Okay. Natural gas, not such a pretty picture. In 2020, when we add natural gas to the regression, in 2020, still significant and positive. So natural gas didn't have any, doesn't explain the asymmetry we see in 2020. In 1990, 91, the same story. But when we go back to 73, 75, we don't, and 1980, we don't see a positive asymmetry when we add the gas to the regression. So gas is having some effect, but only in these two recessions back here. Okay, so this result, we were a little bit disappointed. It wasn't quite as pretty a picture as the result when we just looked at all recessions together rather than breaking things down into individual recessions. So this looks at monthly changes in the GDP. So you can see the 73, 75 recession. This is just looking at the decade of the 70s. And you can see the 1980 recession around about here. And we've detrended it using the Hodrick-Prescott filter so you just look at the fluctuations. This is the 1973 oil price shock. Suddenly there's a big fall in oil use here, and simultaneous with it, there was a fall in gas use, just the same month. And after that, gas use, this is gas and coal together, so coal doesn't really come into it. So basically it's gas and fluctuations. Coal's much smoother. These moved quite closely together with oil throughout this recession, and I don't really know. That needs further research to try to explain why that is the case. Why gas tracked oil so closely during that recession, but it tracks it. So it falls at exactly the same time as oil does when the oil embargo and rising oil prices happened. The two move together. So again, it does seem to be the oil price shock, but gas also responded to that change. In 1980, a bit of a different story. The blue, which is mainly driven by gas, there's a big spike in gas use here. And then next month it fell back again. I've tried to explain that with weather, and I couldn't really adequately explain that with the weather. I looked at regional weather and various things and couldn't explain it. So there's this big drop in gas use in these 2 months that makes it look like gas explains the change in carbon emissions. Of course, it does to a degree, but that's because it went up in the 2 preceding months. On the other hand, when we look at oil use, it was declining right through this oil price shock from a peak here to a low here, and you can see it changed much more than the GDP change, which is the asymmetry we're looking at. So the elasticity is greater than 1 during the recession. And gas just sort of fluctuates up and down because the official recession is just these few months here. It looks like gas is also correlated to the change in carbon emissions that happen. So it is correlated, but it's a little bit of an artifact, I would argue. Okay, so not a perfect picture, but it's still looking at these oil recessions. Recessions, so the oil shocks have got a story going on here. So we then looked at what about different sectors? What about sectors that use oil versus other fuels? So we regressed changes in sectoral carbon emissions on changes in the national GDP. The reason I don't use sector GDP is if I put transport GDP to explain transport emissions, which makes sense, well, of course, in 2020, transport sector had aviation and so forth all had a decline in output. So of course, that would explain the you wouldn't see necessarily an outsized elasticity, because it's the fall in output in this sector which drove the change in the outsized change in carbon emissions. So we look at the change of a national GDP, how it's related to the sectoral emissions, even though those might not make much sense as a causal model. That's not what we're not interested in sort of a true model or a causal model here. So these are the 5 sectors that EIA give data on: residential, commercial, industrial, transport, electric power. Get the simple asymmetric model, again, economic growth and the recession dummy times economic growth. 2 sectors have an asymmetry, and it's industrial and transport. And transport uses like 2/3 of oil use, industrial like 25% or so, and these other sectors use very little oil use. So the 2 sectors that use most of the oil are the sectors where have an asymmetry, and the other sectors there isn't an asymmetry. So this is a better story, a nicer looking story, but it's all about the oil. And we also tried looking at the controlling for oil and for other fossil fuel use in these individual sectors. And when you include the oil changes in oil use in the regression, those are not linearly related to GDP. In transport, where it pretty much just uses oil, there's now no longer a positive effect, there's a significant negative effect, which is kind of strange, we sort of overdid it. Industrial, there still is a positive effect, but it's only significant at the 10% level, an asymmetry. So just maybe there is some other story going on besides the oil story, but it's that putting oil into the regression did reduce the asymmetry, so it seems like oil at least partly explains the asymmetry in industrial, but it totally explains what happened in transport. When we use coal and natural gas, these regression results are almost exactly the same as before we put any energy variable into the regression. The coefficients almost don't change in both the industrial and transport sector. So here, there's a very neat result. Oil explains the asymmetry. Other fossil fuel use doesn't explain that asymmetry. Finally, we did do some distributed lag models with lags for GDP growth and lags for the GDP growth and recessions. For the asymmetric model, I think the optimal lag length was 2, and for the symmetric one, 4, or vice versa. I'm not 100% right now. I looked in the paper and it wasn't very clear, so I have to go back to my Schuerting and ask her. She did the actual regressions. So I've shown here no lags, 2 lags, and 4 lags. So here's the estimated, now an estimated long-run elasticity in using no lags, 2 lags, and 4 lags during expansions, and the estimated long-run elasticity during recessions, and the difference between the two. So with no lags, there's a big difference between the two. With 2 lags, less of a difference between the two. With 4, even less. So what's going on here seems to be a fairly short-run effect. If you have a model with more lags, and to estimate long run effect, long run, there's numerically a difference. It wasn't not statistically significant at for normal levels which are used. So there's more of a short run effect happening and not so much a long one. This also seems to make sense when we relate this to oil market disruptions, like particularly the 2021. So not so long-lived, more of a short-run disruption is explaining the asymmetry as the degree it exists. And this matches previous results that people have used with lags as well. Okay, so rounding up, and some conclusions and looking forward to the future as well, or the present. So we found asymmetric response here to the GDP seems to be associated with these negative oil market shocks and not particularly with recessions per se. It seems to be related to transport and industrial emissions. And the 2020 recession is not so unusual. There was a negative demand shock. That was what was unusual rather than a negative supply shock. But the fall in energy use resulted in this seeming, this CO2 falling faster than the GDP fell compared to what it typically does in an expansion. So not too different to 1973-5 or 1990 and so forth, but of course the mechanism is different. Okay, so thinking about the current situation, are we having an oil price shock right now? So this is the daily price of oil, West Texas Intermediate crude. So there's no disruption happening in the US, the oil price, because oil is traded globally, and so there's a shock somewhere else in the system. It's transmitted everywhere. So price rose following the Russian invasion of Ukraine to $130. Since then, it's fallen back. Why? Is this because China is shutting down Shenzhen and other places because of COVID-19? Is it because people realize maybe they overdid the rise in price? Who knows? And who knows if it will stay down? Still, $95 is quite a high price. Is what it reached before this most recent shock. Will it stay down? Will it go up again? No one knows at this stage. If it starts coming down again, then either there is a recession coming. It will look a bit more like the 1981-82 recession, where oil prices were already declining before the recession started, or 2000, and not so much like the ones where there was already a recession simultaneous to oil prices. This shock is only a few days here, so it's probably very much too early to say. On whether there's a recession coming, well, as we said earlier, when the Federal Reserve starts raising interest rates, often it ends up with a recession. This is the difference between the 10-year and 2-year US government bond yields. And if it's high, there's probably not a recession coming. If it's low, well, it could be low for a while before a recession arrives. So a fairly flat yield curve, as it's called, is not necessarily an indicator a recession is going to happen. And here we are, fairly flat. The curve was pretty flat just before the pandemic happened. It rose after the pandemic. Now we're back going towards where we were before the recession started. The Federal Reserve this is the 2-year and 10-year rate difference. Now the Federal Reserve is starting to push up the 3-month rate effectively, or the using the federal funds rate. So could be a recession coming, and if oil prices remain very high, maybe it would look like the asymmetric ones. If oil prices start coming down again before we get to recession, again, thinking just about the United States in particular, yeah, it probably wouldn't look like it wouldn't be one of the asymmetric recessions. Just be a very short-lived oil price shock, which then dies out. We don't know, but happy to discuss further. So that sort of rounds things up. Actually, fairly close to the time. I expected it would be quicker, but there we are. Okay, so happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much, David. So very interesting. So we have some questions. I know, so I collected the questions. So I have a couple. So in order to discuss about your presentation. So summarizing what I understood, so there are these asymmetric shocks strong depending on the effect on oil market, so the energy market more wider, so not out in the oil, When there is supply shocks and demand shocks, especially the last one is on demand, the other one are on supply that you have stressed, as 73 and 75. 70 and 75 is the period.
The recession was 73 to 5. The 979 shock.
Exactly. One question is, given that is the shock passed through the energy market, is also demonstrated by the fact that the other recession, 2007, 2008, has not the same impact on CO2 in this effect. Maybe there is also a link with respect to all the market. No? So the question is possible also to serve in another direction, not focusing on the crisis, but focusing on the energy market, in the case in which we have a supply shock on the oil, for example, like for example in shale oil in 2015, when we have a declining oil price, or that we have also demonstrated also the other case in 2008, really, because we have a declining price. In the first case, due to a bubble that bursts from the stock market. The second case, in my opinion, 2015 could be more interesting in the case in which we have an increase of oil supply and a change of a global economy. Summarizing the point is, it's possible also to check, according to your analysis, if it's possible to focus on a possible supply shock, not the crisis, but supply shock in general. Second point is related to this decoupling, the phenomenon of decoupling. So now we have a reduction of CO2. My question is if could be very strong geographical dependent. So US data, obviously, we are in a process in which we have a certain technology, maybe looking also to, I don't know, European Union, we could have other different effects. So it could be an intuition behind this, the same shock, but maybe different effects in terms of CO2 emission for two reasons, maybe. One, maybe because the European Union is technological, or is a Green New Deal that can enhance the green economy, or we have a different government. So during the Trump period, obviously the policy in the US are different, and so we could have a different effect. In these days, today, unfortunately, due to war, we are also looking at, and there is also research here in FIM, in which not me, but the group in FIM are demonstrated, are checked. We could be the effect of a reduction of gas supply in Italy. The 43% of the total gas supply comes from Russia. The effect, the projection of this is that if the input of gas from Russia close suddenly due to crisis, we have not sufficient gas in order to cover the total energy. So which is the reaction of our government to reactivate, to restart the carbon plants. So this decoupling phenomenon moves due to a bottleneck on energy. So energy is very strong, and also in order to do that. So I enlarged a little bit with the question, but are very, very interesting on this point.
Okay, I'll try to answer these questions. Okay. I remember. Yeah, so looking at 2015, there's a positive supply shock when fracking took off in the US. There were other things Saudi Arabia was doing as well, and the oil price fell. Well, look, I mean, we think about demand for energy, rises in income are going to increase energy use, falls in income are going to decrease it, but of course, changes in price goes up. We expect people to use less, and vice versa. And in the short run, the price elasticity is quite small, so we expect quite big changes. So I'd expect, if you go look at the data, that emissions rose faster in the relative GDP in 2015-14 when the oil price fell than they would have done in the period when oil prices were stable, because there's sort of just demand for oil. Yeah, I mean, it's a fall in price. It's sort of an exogenous fall in price to the sort of demand function, which go down the demand curve and consume more oil or other forms of energy. So yeah, I would expect to see that. My question was more about in this research was, is there something unusual about recessions that has energy use of fossil fuels falling faster relative to the change in when it expands and expansions? There's something intrinsic to it, and our conclusion is there isn't anything really intrinsic. It's just that a lot of recessions are associated with these dislocations in oil markets, whether they cause recessions or not. So we see the effects of shocks to the oil market on oil use happening at the same time as a recession. If you disentangle these two things, the business cycle and carbon emissions look a lot more symmetric, but there may be some effect in the industrial sector, but it looks a lot more symmetric than when you just see the world as it unfolds. Now, and so in 2007, 9 or so, yeah, energy use fell because there was a recession. So people's income fell. They used less. It wasn't a sort of exogenous shock in terms of energy supply. It wasn't really a change in demand behavior. It was just the standard, well, they have less income, there's less economic activity, and there's less energy use, less energy demanded. So that's what I see happening then. So it pretty much fell pretty in line with what it would do in an expansion, ceteris paribus, for this sort of constant technical change kind of thing that's been going on. Looking at geographic differences, yeah, so the US is particularly oil-dependent economy. So there are some studies that looked across a lot more countries, but mostly using annual data. So it's a bit hard to sort of get enough detail to understand what's really happening in annual data. But yeah, other economies that are have less energy use going to transport will probably see smaller effects than the US would. On the other hand, we looked at Italy in 2020. We saw Italy had a tremendous reduction in mobility. The early slide I showed. So 2020 Italy might look even more extreme than the US. So yeah, so Europe is less energy intensive to start with, may perhaps shifted more to a little bit more to renewables. What about gas supply shock in the current situation? So if gas supply is either cut off by Russia or the Europeans decide to boycott, to not use it and boycott Russian gas supply. So yeah, it's a supply shock on gas. So yeah, we'd expect to see, there's a sudden shortage of gas, to see less carbon emissions from that. Now, again, it's not particularly connected to whether there would be a recession at the same time or not. Maybe there would be, because maybe it would cause it, maybe it wouldn't. But I'd expect to see a steep fall in carbon emissions from a fall in gas, and it's hard to substitute very much in the short run to coal or something for applications such using gas. So yeah, so we just haven't seen sort of gas market shocks at the scale of oil market shocks historically. So there's nothing special about oil. It's just it's traded globally, so the price reacts globally. That is something special about oil. It is traded more extensively than gas. Gas increasingly is not a local market, but historically it was more of a local market. With more pipelines and LNG, it's getting more global, but there's still big differences in the gas price across the world. But just, yeah, there haven't been these historically big disruptions in gas supply of the scale of the oil dislocations, but there might be one now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yes, it's very big problem. Okay, now I leave the floor to other colleagues. Otherwise, I take all the time. Now I leave the floor to Alessio D'Amato, that is the president of the Italian Association of Environmental Resource Economists. Should be now online with the camera. Alessio, if you are here, if you can switch on.
Can you hear me? And now
Yes.
maybe you can also see me.
Yep.
We are able to, yes.
Good morning, and thanks a lot for this very interesting and challenging for me webinar. I'm not an expert in this kind of methodology, so I apologize in advance if my question may sound a bit naive, but given that as an environmental economist, my interest goes immediately to the implications of your work for carbon emissions and for climate policy. So my question is a bit broad in the sense that my understanding is that clearly in the previous periods and recessions that you considered, or at least in most of the cases, we cannot expect a big role played by the possible impact of climate policies on prices. But I was wondering if, or if you can expect that in the future, for your analysis, for example, the analysis of the current period, at least part of this asymmetry may be explained or driven by an increase in the credibility of the climate policy targets, for example, in the European Union, or the increases in stringency in the climate policy targets in some parts of the world. Thanks.
I mean, if there's a generally decline in carbon emissions, if that does happen, happening in some countries, obviously, yeah. So the size of changes in carbon emissions are going to be lower. I think in terms of this, it's more important what sectors are decarbonised first. So whether it's if it is going to be transport, mostly first in power generation, which is where sort of replacing coal with renewables. So it's that would therefore have less impact on my story going forward. I mean, until eventually we get rid of fossil fuels in all sectors. So it's not clear. So the moment is power generation, will next be transport. So that sort of sequence is going to affect whether we'll see something similar to this in the future. Maybe the more relevant, maybe the thing is if people saw in the COVID-19, well, there was a big fall in carbon emissions. Maybe this is showing there's going to be a permanent change in. We're not going to, but there was a lot about. There was still a rapid bounce back. So it's when people, well, there is some fall in transport use for people. There is a bit more remote work and a bit more people staying at home, but most of it bounced back again. So not read too much. A lot of the time people are reading too much into short-run fluctuations. Like carbon emissions are constant for a year or two in China, and everyone is like, oh, it's the end of China is peaking, and then next year it rises again or something. So so it was short. So yeah, not read too much into those short-run fluctuations. Yeah, I think in terms of this story, it's really which sectors decarbonize and which ones are susceptible to these kinds of shocks. And maybe the future is going to have more gas market shocks than oil shocks.
Okay. So basically, this means that policymakers that are designing climate policies should take the possible asymmetries as exogenous, at least in the short run.
Yeah, it's just something.
With respect to climate policy, I mean.
Yeah.
This is an important indication.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be it's a fairly short-run kind of effect. It's not really that recessions are getting this huge step down in emissions. Some people have been arguing that there's a recessions. I had a paper which said without recessions there wouldn't have been any carbon emissions would have been much bigger. I reviewed for a journal and I kind of I can't remember the details of it, and it's always saying with and they had the collapse of the Soviet Union as that explained almost all their reduction in emissions. They called the collapse of the Soviet Union a recession. But yeah, so there's an argument that these recessions cause these sort of big step downs in emissions, and sort of degrowth would do something sort of similar. This is a bit misguided. It's might be something going on at the same time as recessions happen. Sometimes it's going on, energy market shocks. Sometimes it's not. It's not the recessions. We have a sort of staircase going down. Each recession pushes us to a lower level of carbon emissions, which some people might interpret this as. So having recessions is not that, it's a short run effect. It's not that permanent. Because I went back to the beginning, I said, well, Sheldon said is maybe they scrap all the energy intensive capital, and that's what it's about. That doesn't seem to be the story.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Alessio. Thank you. Now,
Thank
you. Now I leave the floor to Enrico Turco, that is a researcher in FIM and also postdoc in Catholic University in Milan. Okay, Enrico, the floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. So basically, from the results of your regression, you showed that the degree of asymmetry between changes in emission GDP in expansion versus recession varies depending on the type of the shock. No, it's specific to different type of shock. I was wondering whether this relationship may also be dependent on may depend also on the size of the shock. So basically, if the size of the shock is limited, firms now remains active, they will continue to operate, and in order to operate, they have certain will have a certain energy demand, they produce a certain level of emissions. While if the size of the shock is huge, they may be forced to close the production or to go to bankrupt, and so they will this will significantly impact on the level of emission. For instance, we've seen during the COVID crisis, the government mandated the lockdown or imposed a closure of firms, and this has a significant impact. This had a significant impact on the level of emission. So I was wondering whether you take also into account in your analysis the size and the length of the shock, and maybe the impact on the default rate of the firms, whether they remain active or not.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So you're really arguing for an asymmetry related to the size of the shock, right? So the bigger it's non-linear. It gets bigger the bigger the shock. Well, I haven't tested for that. I guess that might be of interest. I mean, remember here, it's also consumer behavior, and especially as I say, a lot of what we've seen is in transport. A lot of it is consumer use of vehicles, and I don't know. Maybe if gasoline price doesn't rise very much, they don't react very much. I don't know. But when it jumps up to $5 a gallon in the US, then they go in shock and actually drive less. Yeah, I don't know what the demand elasticity looks like. Is it also increasing as the is it not constant? I don't know. Pinning these things down is pretty hard empirically. I think we've found. So I'm guessing here it probably would be hard to test this, but it's something we could look. Be a shock, be a effect. Yeah, okay, we could look at that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good question. So the magnitude of the shock is so in terms of length, and so the magnitude could be interesting. And there is another questions, and I'm checking on the my mobile if there is a communication on this by chat. I think it should arrive last question by chat.
Okay. Oh, I see here.
Yes.
Considering your research question from a longer term point of view, interesting to have analysis provided by the environmental Kuznets curve, which explains the relationship between GDP growth and environmental impact. Which connections do you see between the conclusions of your paper and these curves? Well, yeah, I've done quite a lot of research on the environmental Kuznets curve, going back to our first paper on it back in 1996. A general finding from our research on the so-called environmental Kuznets curve is for most pollutants we've looked at, when you use more sophisticated methods than some of the early studies did, and try to separate things out between a time effect, similar to what I had in these regressions, effect of time, whether there is growth or no growth, and the effect of growth itself, it tends to be that there isn't really this inverted U-shaped curve, that growth in economic output tends to cause more pollution, ceteris paribus, but over time there are things which are making economic activity cleaner. Okay, so there's a negative time effect, and that's sort of the general conclusion of our research, and it looks pretty similar to the kind of results we're seeing here, in terms of economic output or decline. Both have an effect on carbon emissions, also in the short run, and it's fairly symmetric. And the decline in emissions you're seeing is this sort of constant grinding away at energy intensity and decarbonization that's just going on. Kind of in the background. So it does actually show a similar picture to what I show here in some way, I think. We do find that in the richer countries, maybe the elasticity is smaller. Depends which pollutants you look at and which data. Smaller than developing economies, but for things like carbon emissions or sulfur emissions, it's hard to find that there's a turning point, and then GDP has the opposite effect on emissions than it does otherwise. I mean, eventually, yeah, you'd expect with decarbonisation, the GDP will have no effect on carbon emissions one day, because there won't be any. But it's not we get richer than the growth reduces emissions. In the short run, at least, if the economy grows in a given year more than expected, carbon emissions rise more than expected in that year from a general long-term trend, and vice versa if the economy contracts. So yeah, so that scale effect is there, but yeah, we'd expect to have less effect as the economy decarbonizes, but not a negative effect. I mean, there are some pollutants, maybe there is a negative, like concentration of PM 2.5 or something like that. We've managed to find a turning point for those, but not for these sort of emissions data and for these sort of things like carbon. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. We have arrived at other questions that maybe I can write to you after. I don't want to, because we are very close to finish now. We have okay. So thank you, but thank you very much for your time. So for your time also, because good night. So I have to say good night because here is late there in Australia. Thank you very much. Again, I invite when it's possible to come here. So
that'd be very nice.
An honor, a pleasure. Also, thanks also to the participants, and thank you.
Yeah, if anyone wants to send me questions they didn't manage to ask, I'll be happy to answer them.
Yeah, I collected. Yeah, you can. So I have other questions. So related to, for example, if it's possible to do by using also Australian data, why not to use? Because I know that the market is different. We have some research on data on energy, electrical data on Australia. We checked on the effect on carbon price on your market.
Yeah.
Why use the US? I understand the US data is the same on Europe, because in general they work on US for also because it's, again, there are a lot of different data Another is related also to the comparison between this kind of because in my mind, but I'm thinking about so broadly speaking, I'm thinking about the evolution of the system. No? So it's more related to the last questions because it's, according to my opinion, there is a change in the process, and the coupling is also an evolving process. No, depending on policy and so on. So the impact should be different. My view, this period, the crisis could be more similar to the stagflation in 1973 due to a shock. But obviously there are differences, and it's very, very interesting to understand which differences there are now, also related to the resilience of each country depending on the supply, because the use of supply increased a lot, the use of resources increased a lot. I'm looking to Italy, but also to Germany. 70% of the German gas comes from Russia, so they are not independent. There is a shock, the shock can, and this, which could be the effect on energy transition, because we have to have in mind, to be reminded that our, as environmental economists, our target should be net zero emission 2050 or something like that, in order to avoid an increase of this is the big picture in my mind. Yes. So the two questions that I'm thinking during your visit.
Yeah, it'd certainly be interesting to look at more countries. As said, a lot of previous literature looked at the US and with monthly data for all these variables. It's very nice, but yes, I think we can look at more countries. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your time. Again, we will see.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye-bye.